As we go into our frame settings right there, we'll be covering the Walls tab. The rest of the tabs should be fairly self-explanatory. If you need any more in-detail assistance on those tabs, make sure to get in touch with us on the customer portal or directly with one of the design team. Okay, first off, what we're going to do is we need to generate a default template for our settings. So this means our horizontal spacings, vertical spacings, the lintel heights, what the lintels look like, their settings. As we go on, everything will be explained into detail, so make sure to stick all the way to the end of this video. So first off, we click on the three dots right there, and we're going to get started with our horizontals. I want you to make sure that you stay within this window. I will show you exactly how this works on a wall. Please make sure to stay within this window in your project settings, as this will change all settings going forward and not just one wall. When you change these settings on one wall at a time, it is not going to take effect on your settings going forward, but only on that particular wall. So, as I mentioned, make sure to stay within your universal settings. You can watch the video all the way to the end and make sure to take the settings and change them according to your requirements. Okay, for the first example, what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at one of these standard wall panels right there. Okay, I'm moving the window to the side so we get a clear view of what the panel does in 3D view when changing these settings. So first off, we'll go to the horizontals section right there in the frame items, layout, and horizontals. Within that box right there, we've got even spread and fixed spread. So to explain these, what they actually mean is even spread will space your horizontal elements evenly from a start to finishing position. You'll note my wall height is set to 2.7 meters high or 2,700 millimeters. If I were to space my horizontals, meaning those horizontals right there, and by the way, we will refer to these horizontals as noggins or horizontals. Okay, so what happens is if I change this to be exactly the center of my wall height right there, I only have one horizontal. Anything less than the center, for example, 49 right there, it is going to generate 2. So like the setting says, it will evenly space from a start to finishing point with a maximum value as you place it in the settings right there. So generally, I try to stick to a single horizontal. Anything from 0 to 2.7, anything higher, I then have a chat with our engineer to make sure that we conform to the correct requirements. So I'll keep mine changed to the center right there. If I create it at 1.4, just another example, it's still only going to be using one horizontal in the center right there. So within the settings, let's jump to the fixed spread option right there. What the fixed spread does, exactly as it sounds, we're going to be using the first one. So this is from 0 to the first horizontal that we'll be placing. So let's say we'll place it at 500 millimeters from the ground. The next one, let's place this one 1 meter from the first one. And then all the others, let's place them at 300 millimeters. As soon as we hit rebuild, you can see what it does is 500 from the bottom, 1 meter, and then all the rest would be using 300 all the way to the top. Okay, so we can change this back to being even spread if we need to keep it standard. If we go a little bit more down, we've got alternate spacing. So what the alternate spacing does, if we set it to a decent spacing right there, and we hit rebuild, it will alternate or stagger my horizontal elements right there. So you can see it has spaced them 50 millimeters apart. The measurements are done from the web section to the web section right there. So we can change this back and turn it off and hit rebuild. You can see it's back to normal. We can change the spacing to whatever requirements we have. For example's sake, turning it into 150 and setting on the alternate spacing and hit rebuild. You can see it's spaced now with 150. If I turn this off, I'll just change it back to the original settings, just like that. Now the next option within our settings menu right there is the minimum length. What the minimum length indicates is the minimum length that you can manufacture or design on the inside of your elements. So if anything on your horizontal section is shorter than 45 millimeters, it will not produce it from the design and also not from the machine. The next option is your verticals. So the verticals will also be labeled as studs. The exact same principle applies when you talk about the even spread versus your fixed spread, where even spread will take from a start to finish point and evenly space from a starting to finishing point with a maximum value of whatever you set in that text box. Now, if I change this to be 400 for example's sake, and I hit rebuild, you can see when I click on the stud, it is spaced now currently with 377. If I change this back to 600 and I hit rebuild, you can see the even spacing from a start to finishing point is currently set to be 538 millimeters. Okay, within this setting, if we go to the fixed spread option, there is a dual function to the fixed spread. So the first one is just a fixed spread all the way from start to finish. The next one is for full frame. Let me explain to you what the differences are between these two. If we have a look at a frame with an opening like this one, and I change the setting to be a fixed spread, and I make sure that my settings for my first and other is correct, I can click rebuild. The starting point would be on the left-hand side right there. You can see my first one is 583 millimeters from that one right there. And the next stud right there is at 600 millimeters. So what happens right now is when we use the fixed spread option and start to finishing, the finishing would be the start of our window opening. The next one from that point to the start of your window opening would be 583. The next one spaced from that point would be 600. From that point to there would be 600. We place a measurement on this. You can see it is 600. Okay, and it stops then with that spacing at the end of the window. The spacing starts again when you get to the next option there of the stud, 583, and continues with 600 from that point. If we change the setting to a full frame and we hit rebuild, you'll notice it starts with the 583 and goes on with 600 from that point all the way through. The reason we have this option available is generally we have cladding material or lining material that you need to attach on the outside of your wall panel. Now, spacing your studs correctly apart would make sure that the cladding material has a good connection point from the first cladding to the second cladding option, both sitting to the center of a stud. So the starting point would have 1.2 meters to the side, like this, and then you start again from that point in the center with your second piece of cladding to that point right there. Depending on the size of the cladding that you want to use to attach to those studs, that's the spacing requirements that you need to stick to. Also, please make sure to chat with your engineer to make sure the spacing that you use is correct. For the next option in our frame settings is the option to use a truss align for our studs. You can see this is still in our vertical tab, and we've got our vertical option for truss align. Exactly as it sounds is what it does. It will automatically align your studs to a truss if you have it on there. So if we have a look at this example I have on my screen right now, I have placed trusses on my walls. You can see if I zoom in there, the red indicates a load bearing point. You can see my studs are not completely in line with my trusses right there. So we need to go to that setting within my wall panel and change the truss align to be on and hit rebuild. You can see after that it has changed my spacing of my studs or verticals to be placed right underneath my trusses. We turn that off and change it to the even spread. We can hit rebuild and you can see it is no longer in line with my trusses. The same thing applies as soon as we go to the support align or the joist align options. we place supports on the walls, it will automatically adjust your stud spacing according to the support alignment. Same for your joists. As soon as we go to the doubles option, what that does is it changes all of your studs or every second stud to be a back-to-back member or a double. So if I change that to all, you can see all of my studs are back-to-back. Or I can change the setting to be alternate and hit rebuild. So every second stud is doubled up. So make sure to keep it on none unless you are informed otherwise by your engineer. Within the lintel setting right there, what we have is the ability to change settings on our lintel. The lintel itself is from that bottom part right there to the actual top of the lintel. Okay, we can change the height of this lintel right there. If we wanted to change it to 300, for example, it changes and reduces the height from 350 that it was to 300. We can change this back to 350 and hit rebuild. The brace pitch right there indicates the angle of those diagonal members, in this case being the braces. The lintel top chord right there, if I zoom in slightly, you can see this is a back-to-back member or a double in that case, where you can change it from a single option to a double. I'll hit rebuild. You can see this is what a single top chord looks like. You can change it to be a double again, and there we go. The next option is the double lintel gap. What the double lintel gap is an actual tolerance introduced into the steel. So the reason we have this double lintel gap or tolerance introduced within your steel connections is if you don't have this tolerance introduced right there, it will be virtually impossible to assemble these steel sections. So to show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to place it in there and change the angle so you can see where the gap is placed right now. That is your top chord, and that's the double on top of that top chord. So after the double lintel gap right there, we've got the lintel jack studs. What the lintel jack studs are, right next to the lintels, you'll see these small connection studs, and we'll call them lintel jack studs. Okay, I'll hit rebuild so you can see what I'm talking about is that item right there, and the opposite right there would be referred to as lintel jack studs. So what they actually do is make connection with your lintels to the rest of the frame a lot easier and stronger. If we turn this option off and hit rebuild, you can see it is your lintel just connecting straight to the opening stud. So we'll make sure to keep the lintel jack studs on. The next option is to change from a bottom lintel to a top. We can click on the top one to activate that box and then click rebuild. As you can see, it completely mirrors to the top and keeps the lintel now on the top rather than the bottom. So we'll keep it at the bottom for the time being, unless instructed otherwise by your engineer. Additional strengthening goes into your plating material. So what you'll need to do is make sure that the plate is active or the L-headed, depending on the requirements of your engineer. What it actually does, it automatically adds a plating on one side or two sides after inserting your window. So as soon as your lintel reaches a set distance or opening in that sense, it will automatically plate one or two sides of that lintel. To show you how this works, I'll generate a window opening large enough to have one side and then two sides plated. So editing the window size of my current window to 1800 to display our lintel on one side right there. If I change my window opening to be 2.4 meters or higher, it will automatically plate both sides. So make sure to keep that option on. Our next option is the miscellaneous section right there. We've got a back-to-back separation, also again meaning your tolerance for connecting to back-to-back elements. So to show you what this does, when you have a double, I'll quickly generate a back-to-back member for this stud, and we can zoom in there slightly. I'll rotate the design so you can see the gap between those two elements. The next one is your section flange height, so please make sure to insert the correct flange height according to your machine that you have purchased. The next one is your end adjustment. So what the end adjustment does is exactly the same. It is for tolerance. If you have two walls at the end and one on the inside, where it connects to another wall, let's say for example you have a 6-meter length of your wall, it will in actual fact be 5.999 meters. The reason for that is again for tolerance where you have one C-section connected to another. The user group section right there is connected to our groups button, which gives you the ability to hide or unhide your elements. The selected frame gives you an output of the area used, the meterage of steel, and the weight depending on your steel that you've selected for this frame. The next option is to export to Rollformer. The RF is short for Rollformer, so you can turn this on or off. I would suggest to keep it on unless you're not planning on manufacturing those walls. The next option is to turn on the double rivet, yes or no. And then we also have the ability to turn on solid walls. This only gives you the look of having a solid built frame like this. And you can also choose to turn it off. Within your opening settings right there, we have the ability to control some of our opening options. So currently you can see right next to my opening stud, we have an additional opening stud. As you can see, that is what it's referred to within this box right there. The first one is saying, what is the spacing to the first double stud? Okay, from the opening stud to the next stud right there is going to be a 100 millimeter. As soon as your opening reaches a set distance, this is what it will generate is an additional opening stud. If it reaches even further distance, it will make sure that this one is a back-to-back member. So if we have a look at these settings, you can see currently my opening is set to be 1.8 meters, so it will automatically add a stud. As soon as it reaches 2 meters, it will add another additional stud. So to show you what this looks like, I will introduce a larger opening. So now you can see we have a back-to-back member on our additional studs. The next option is to create an extended lintel. So what the extended lintel does, instead of having a lintel jack stud right there, it extends your lintel all the way to the additional opening studs. So let's change that pretty quick. We need to make sure to turn off the lintel jack studs option right there and go back to my openings, turn on extend lintels and hit rebuild so you can see what that option does. To turn that off and go back to the lintel jack studs, make sure to turn it off, go to your lintels and make sure to keep lintel jack studs on and hit rebuild. The same thing applies as soon as we get to the window sill right there at the bottom. As soon as we reach a set distance on our opening, it will automatically add an additional windowsill. If it reaches a further distance, it will add another one, creating a back-to-back sill. We can choose to have the sill opening. We can choose to have the C-section of the profile facing your opening or facing away of the opening by clicking on that box right there. And also with your opening studs, you can have that active or inactive right there. Your next option is to go to the engineering tab right there and make sure to select the correct profile for your machine. After selecting the correct profile, make sure to go back to frame items and we're going to click on this save button right there. It looks like a floppy drive and you're going to call it whatever you need when you recall this setting. So make sure to call it something that will be easy to identify within your dropdown on your settings. I'm going to go back to my project settings within my frames, and that drop down right there, you can see where that wall setup template has been saved. Now, every time you start a new design, you can go to your project settings, frame settings, and recall that template right there, so you don't have to reset all of these settings every single time when starting a new project.